ambassador from the Veluun Compact arrived on Tuesday. Mara Chen noticed this because Tuesdays were when she ran the waste filtration diagnostics on Sublevel 9, and the notification that diverted her from that task came with a priority code she'd never seen before, not in 11 years working infrastructure support at the Geneva Coordination Complex. The code wasn't red. It wasn't any color in the standard taxonomy. It was simply blank, a white square where a color should have been. She didn't know yet that the blank code meant the Galactic Alliance had already reached a decision about Earth. She didn't know that the meeting happening 4 floors above her head had technically concluded before it began. She didn't know that the word disarmament had already been transmitted to 17 member species across 43 star systems as a foregone conclusion, a footnote in bureaucratic correspondence, the kind of phrasing reserved for things so obvious they required no debate. What she noticed was that the filtration system on Sublevel 9 registered a pressure anomaly at 7:42 a.m., and that nobody came to fix it. She also noticed, walking past the main corridor on her way to report it, that every security officer in the building was standing very, very still. The Veluun called themselves Architects of Stability, which was the kind of title that sounded generous until you understood what they meant by stability. They had been maintaining what the Alliance officially termed systemic equilibrium for approximately 600 years, and in that time, 31 civilizations had transitioned, their word, from armed sovereignties to what the Veluun's diplomatic materials described as harmonized participant states. There were no wars among harmonized participant states. There was also, Mara would eventually learn, almost no independent decision-making. But the Veluun didn't consider that a loss. They considered it the point. The senior diplomat was called Assessor Erath Vel, and the first thing Mara noticed about him, the first time she saw him through the reinforced glass of the 4th floor observation corridor, was that he was not looking at the humans in the room. He was looking at the room itself, examining the architecture. Running a secondary set of sensory organs, something between fingers and antennae, arranged in a delicate fan behind his primary skull structure, slowly along the wall near the door as though cataloging something that wasn't visible. She asked a colleague what he was doing. Her colleague, a logistics coordinator named Parvez who had been at the complex for longer than anyone, said, "Taking inventory." She thought that was a strange answer. She would think about it for a long time. The formal demand arrived 4 days later, and it was remarkable primarily for its gentleness. There were no threats. There was no ultimatum structured as a threat. The language was the kind of careful, almost apologetic bureaucratic phrasing that implied such complete certainty of compliance that aggression would have been redundant. The Galactic Alliance, through its duly appointed diplomatic mechanisms, had reviewed the current developmental profile of the human species and determined that continued maintenance of planetary armaments, including but not limited to nuclear arsenals, orbital defense systems, and the full inventory of what the document referred to, with clinical understatement, as a persistent harm infrastructure, represented an unacceptable volatility risk to regional stability. Humanity would be invited to formally disarm. A supervised transition process would begin within 90 days. Compliance was expected. Non-compliance was not addressed because the document structure implied non-compliance was not a realistic category of outcome. Mara read the document 3 times, sitting in the break room on Sublevel 4, eating a sandwich she'd stopped tasting halfway through the first read. What stayed with her was not the content. It was the date stamp. The document had been finalized, digitally sealed, allocated a formal alliance case number 6 weeks before the ambassador arrived, before any conversation had taken place, before any human representative had been briefed, consulted, or informed. The decision had been made before the meeting. The meeting had been scheduled so the decision could be delivered. She didn't report to work the next day. Nobody came to ask why. She also noticed that 3 of the 7 security officers who'd been standing still in the main corridor 4 days ago were no longer in the building. The Global Coordination Council's response to the disarmament demand was 17 days of structured diplomatic engagement, and the Veluun participated with what Mara, watching briefing recordings from her new position as a junior communications relay, a role she'd been quietly reassigned to without clear explanation, could only describe as patient theater. Irath Vel answered questions. He clarified terminology. He provided supplementary documentation about the harmonization process that had, he noted gently, proceeded without incident for the civilizations that had participated. He never acknowledged any question about what had happened to those civilizations afterward. A senior human negotiator named Dr. Kira Os raised this directly on day 9. She asked, with the careful precision of someone who had spent her career learning not to flinch from difficult questions, what independent governance capacity had been retained by the most recently harmonized civilization, a species called the Geth Aram who had completed their transition 11 years ago. Irath Vel's response lasted 4 minutes and contained no answer. Dr. Os asked a follow-up question. Irath Vel began to answer. Then he stopped mid-sentence and did something that Mara watched 3 times on the recording without being able to identify. His sensory fan, the delicate arrangement behind his skull, shifted orientation. It moved toward Osai very slightly, and then it contracted. He changed the subject. Mara watched the moment again, and again. She wrote a note to herself, though she wasn't sure why, because she had no one to send it to and no framework to place it in. The note just said, he was surprised by something she said, not the question, something about how she asked it. The 3 security officers who disappeared from the complex reappeared in a report 2 weeks later, not in Geneva, in a town called Arkhangelsk, in a region where, according to the official infrastructure registry, there was nothing of strategic interest. The report was a routine movement log, the kind of document that passed through Mara's relay position dozens of times a day. She wouldn't have noticed it if the case number hadn't matched a subseries she'd been tracking in the filing architecture, not deliberately, but because she was the kind of person who noticed when things didn't fit. The subseries had been created 6 months before the Veluun arrived, before the demand, before the ambassador had walked through the door and touched the wall. She sat with this information for 3 days before she told anyone. She told Parvez. He listened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How many subseries files are there?" She had counted. She told him. He nodded slowly in the way people nod when the number is larger than they were hoping. Then he said something she didn't expect. He said, "Don't look for the others." She asked why. He said, "Because finding them was already more than you were supposed to do." She didn't sleep well for a week, not because of fear exactly, but because she kept returning to something she couldn't resolve. Were those files left where she could find them on purpose? And if so, by whom? The Global Coordination Council announced a preliminary agreement on day 23. It was described as a framework for structured dialogue about the disarmament timeline. It was not, technically, an agreement to disarm. But its language leaned heavily in that direction, and the Veluun's response, a formal acknowledgement transmitted to all alliance members within hours, treated it as functionally equivalent. The human media covered it as a diplomatic success, a crisis averted, the species of Earth wise enough to choose stability over pride. Irath Vel gave a brief statement. He said he was pleased by humanity's mature engagement with the realities of galactic integration. He said the transition process would be conducted with full respect for human cultural continuity. He said nothing about what cultural continuity meant for a species that no longer controlled its own defense. He said nothing about the Geth Aram. He said nothing about the question Dr. Os had asked on day 9, the question he hadn't answered, the question that had made his sensory fan contract. That night, Mara ran a search she'd been constructing for 11 days, careful, fragmented, distributed across 7 different database access points, so it wouldn't resolve into a single traceable query. She was looking for any public record of Geth Aram diplomatic communication after their harmonization. She found 3 documents. All 3 were authored by the Veluun Compact. None were authored by the Geth Aram themselves. She sat in the dark of her apartment and thought about what it meant for a civilization to go quiet, not destroyed, Not at war, just quiet, still present in records as a category, just not speaking anymore in their own voice. She wrote another note to herself. It said, "Is this what stability looks like from the outside?" Then she deleted it because she'd become, in the past several weeks, the kind of person who deleted notes. The anomaly she found on day 31 was the one that changed everything she thought she understood. It wasn't in the disarmament files. It wasn't in the movement logs or the diplomatic correspondence or the filing subseries she wasn't supposed to have found. It was in the maintenance records for the complex's environmental systems. Specifically, the atmospheric regulation array that Erath Vel's delegation had requested be calibrated to Veluun comfort parameters during their extended stay. The calibration request was routine. The technician's implementation report was routine. What was not routine was the secondary notation, buried in the technical appendix, from the engineer who had actually done the work. The notation said, atmospheric particulate reading during calibration showed non-ambient trace compounds at 0.003% above baseline. Source unclear. Flagged for follow-up. There was no follow-up recorded. Mara spent 6 hours cross-referencing the compound's signature against every database she had access to, and several she accessed by methods she had recently and quietly taught herself. The compound didn't appear in any industrial register, any environmental hazard database, any known biological output catalog. It appeared in one place. A xenobiological research paper, published 18 months ago by a University of Cape Town team studying Veluun sensory biology, describing compounds associated with Veluun olfactory cognitive processing, specifically with what the paper called environmental reading, the Veluun capacity to chemically sample and catalog their surroundings. The trace compound was something Erath Vel's body produced when he was using his sensory fan. He had been chemically mapping the building, every room he'd entered, every surface he'd touched. He had been, in a very precise biological sense, taking inventory. Mara thought about Parvez's answer the very first day, taking inventory. She wondered if Parvez had known exactly what he meant when he said it. She wondered what else Parvez knew. She didn't ask him immediately because she needed to first understand what being chemically inventoried meant, what information it provided, what it was used for. She found the answer in a supplementary paper the Cape Town researchers hadn't published. She found it in their internal file archive, which she accessed through a chain of methods that would have troubled her 3 months ago and now simply felt necessary. The supplementary paper described how Veluun environmental reading data was used in their broader harmonization assessment process. It described how the compact built comprehensive structural, logistical, and the word used was resistance topology, profiles of a civilization before and during negotiation. Resistance topology, a map of how a civilization might resist, where its strength concentrated, where it was vulnerable. Erath Vel hadn't just been taking inventory of a building. He'd been mapping them. Mara found Parvez the next morning and told him what she'd found. He didn't look surprised. He looked something more complicated than surprised, the expression of a person receiving confirmation of something they'd spent a long time hoping was wrong. He said, "How detailed is their mapping capability?" She told him what the paper suggested. He was quiet. Then he said, "Then they already know about the factories." She didn't know what factories. He said he needed to show her something, and the way he said it made her understand that this was the conversation he'd been deciding whether to have with her for weeks. He said, "I need you to understand what I'm going to tell you is real, and then I need you to understand why it had to look like nothing was real." They sat in the filtration sublevel 9, where she'd noticed the pressure anomaly on the day the ambassador arrived, the anomaly nobody had come to fix. He told her what the pressure anomaly actually was, what it was connected to, what had been running through the infrastructure of the complex, and through infrastructure systems in 17 other facilities across 6 continents for the past 8 months. She didn't speak for a long time after he finished. Not because she was frightened, though she was, because she was recalibrating everything she thought she'd understood about what the council was doing, about what the preliminary agreement meant. about why nobody had come to fix the pressure anomaly on sublevel 9. The preliminary agreement wasn't a concession, it was a delay. The question that kept her awake that night wasn't the one she expected. It wasn't can this work, it wasn't even should this work. It was something smaller and more personal and more frightening. How long have they been willing to let the galaxy believe we were surrendering? Because that was what it required. Not just preparation, not just infrastructure. It required every human diplomat in that negotiation room to sit across from Irath Vel for 17 days and perform the exact shape of a civilization slowly accepting its own submission, without deviation, without signal, without any moment of resistance that might alert his sensory fan to something worth mapping more carefully. She thought about Dr. Osai's question on day 9, the question about the Jeth Aram. The question that had surprised him, not the content she'd written, but the way it was asked. She thought about that now differently. Dr. Os hadn't been asking because she didn't know the answer. She'd been asking to watch what Irath Vel did when he didn't want to answer. She'd been learning him. In a room where he thought he was the one running assessments, she had been assessing him. Mara thought every question they asked in that room was a question they already knew the approximate answer to. They were watching what he did with them, she thought, and he doesn't know that. She thought he mapped the building. He didn't map the people. The second Veluun ship arrived in orbit on day 47. It was larger than the first. The Alliance communique describing its arrival characterized it as a procedural support vessel for the harmonization process. It carried, according to the manifest shared with the Council, administrative staff, transition coordination equipment, and what the manifest called integration framework infrastructure. The Council acknowledged its arrival with a formal diplomatic note expressing appreciation for the Alliance's commitment to an orderly process. Mara read the acknowledgement and knew, because she now understood what she was reading between, that the Council had been waiting for exactly this. The second ship meant the compact had committed resources. It meant they believed the timeline was real. It meant they'd sent the infrastructure of occupation before confirming the occupation would be accepted. It meant they were confident. She wrote a note that she didn't delete. It said, "Confident civilizations make the same mistake." She thought about what that mistake was. She thought about 600 years of harmonization, 31 civilizations transitioned, the Jeth Aram quiet and still and present in records but not speaking. She thought about what 600 years of success did to an organization's capacity to imagine failure. She thought, they've never had to really map anyone, because everyone eventually agreed, because the math of it, one species against an interstellar alliance, always worked out the same way. So they stopped really looking. They just started cataloging the shape of the submission because the submission always came. She thought, we didn't give them a shape to map. The thing she hadn't understood until Parvez told her about the factories, and she would later realize he'd been deliberately measured about how much he told her that first conversation, holding back specific elements she would only understand fully when she saw them, was that the disarmament conversation had been anticipated, not guessed at, not feared. Anticipated with sufficient lead time that the human response to it had been structurally designed before Irath Vel's ship had entered the solar system. The Veluun believed their approach was innovative in its subtlety. They believed the pre-decision, the foregone conclusion, the framework that treated compliance as a mathematical inevitability, was their edge. What they didn't know, couldn't have known, because it required modeling a civilization that functioned differently from every civilization they'd harmonized, was that humans had an institutional memory of exactly this shape of approach, not from alien contact, from each other, centuries of it. Empires, negotiations, treaties that weren't treaties, agreements that were already decided, the entire archaeological record of what happened when a powerful party decided the outcome before the conversation, and then managed the conversation to deliver it. Humans had done this to each other so many times, across so many centuries, in so many forms, that they had developed something the Veluun had no category for, a civilizational immune response to managed consent. They'd seen this before. Not the aliens, the shape, the architecture of the thing, the way it felt from inside. And because they'd seen it before, because it lived in their institutional memory the way a biological immune system holds the memory of a pathogen, they'd recognized it before Irath Vel's ship finished decelerating. This was what Parvez meant. Not that humanity was stronger, not that humanity had weapons that could match an interstellar alliance, but that humanity had, without realizing it was building one, constructed a library of how power works when it's trying not to look like power. And that library was what they'd used, not to fight, to see clearly, and then to prepare in the dark in the infrastructure in the subseries files that weren't supposed to be found, or were, precisely as much as they were supposed to be. On day 61, Mara was called to the fourth floor for the first time, not to the negotiating rooms, to a smaller room adjacent to them, windowless, which she had not known existed. Dr. Osai was there. Two people she didn't recognize were there. Parvez was not. Dr. Osai did not look like someone who had spent 2 months performing submission. She looked like someone who had been doing something very specific for a long time and was approaching the moment where it resolved. She said, "We need a relay operator with your specific access profile for the next 48 hours. Can you do that?" Mara said yes before she'd fully processed the question. Dr. Osai said, "The assessor has requested a final verification session tomorrow. He wants to confirm the inventory of systems slated for decommission." Mara understood, from everything she'd learned in the past 30 days, what this meant. The compact was requesting confirmation that what they had mapped, the resistance topology, the infrastructure, the persistent harm infrastructure listed in the original demand, was genuinely all of it, a final check against their own data. Irath Vel would bring his map and the humans would confirm its accuracy. She said, "What do we confirm?" Dr. Os looked at her for a moment in a way that felt like evaluation. Then she said, "Everything he mapped. We confirm everything he mapped is exactly where he thinks it is and exactly what he thinks it is." Mara thought about the pressure anomaly on sublevel 9. She thought about the trace compounds. She thought about a sensory fan that cataloged rooms and surfaces and atmospheric composition and the shape of resistance. She thought about everything his map did not include, because he had mapped the building and not the people. Because he had been performing assessment in rooms where he believed he was the one assessing. Because 600 years of successful harmonization had given the compact such profound confidence in the inevitability of the outcome that they'd never seriously asked what a civilization that had done this to itself, over and over, for its entire recorded history, what a civilization like that might do when it recognized the shape of the thing being done to it. She said, "So we confirm his map is complete." Dr. Osai said, "We confirm his map is complete." The verification session lasted 9 hours. Mara ran relay for all of it, sitting in the adjacent room, routing communications, processing the data streams that Irath Vel's delegation transmitted back to the second ship in orbit. She couldn't see the room directly, but she could hear it through the audio feed, and she could watch the data moving. She watched Irath Vel's map fill in. She watched, in real time, as the compact's assessment of Earth's weapons inventory, defense architecture, and resistance topology was confirmed, system by system, through official documentation, technical specifications, and what sounded, on the audio feed, like a room full of people performing the very particular kind of cooperation that looks like exhausted, reluctant concession. It was the most precise performance she had ever witnessed, and she realized, listening to it, that these were people who had spent 2 months preparing not just the infrastructure but themselves. Their voices, their body language, the specific texture of how a civilization sounds when it is deciding to accept what it cannot change. She thought, this is also something humans know how to do, from the inside, from having been on this side before. At hour 7, Irath Vel's secondary sensory fan, she could hear the faint signal adjustment in the room's atmospheric monitors when he used it, swept the room for the 4th time. Each sweep had come back consistent. Each sweep confirmed what his map already said. A predictable, cooperative, navigable civilization in the late stages of accepting the inevitable. The data streamed to the second ship showed his assessment updating in real time. She watched the confidence metrics climbing. She watched the compact's resistance topology model for Earth resolving toward what she knew their category system labeled as harmonization ready. She thought about the pressure anomaly on sublevel 9, still unfixed, still running at 0.003% above standard, through the infrastructure of this building and 17 others and 6 continents of systems that Arath Vel had not mapped, could not have mapped, because he had been mapping the things he knew to look for and the things he'd been shown. At hour 9, the session concluded. Arath Vel transmitted his formal assessment to the second ship. The data package was large, comprehensive, the work of a 600-year-old institution doing what it did with practiced precision. Mara watched the transmission complete. She waited. The response from the second ship came in 14 minutes. It was brief. It was formatted as a routine acknowledgement. It contained, in its procedural language, what the compact considered a formality, confirmation that the harmonization framework would move to implementation phase. Mara relayed it to Dr. Osai. Dr. Osai read it. She didn't change expression. She said quietly to the room, 90 days. One of the 2 people Mara didn't recognize said, 41. Dr. Osai nodded. Mara thought she understood and then realized she didn't quite, and then over the next 3 seconds understood completely. The compact believed they had 90 days until implementation. The 90 days in the preliminary agreement. The timeline that had seemed from the outside like the shape of a civilization buying time because it couldn't think of anything else to do. 41 days ago, the factories had finished. The factories Parvez had told her about. The infrastructure running through sublevel 9 and 17 other facilities. Not weapons, in the sense Arath Vel had been mapping. Not anything in his resistance topology. Something else entirely, something that didn't exist in his 600-year institutional library, because it had never needed to exist before, because no previous civilization had looked at an interstellar alliance demanding disarmament and thought, what if we disarm everything they're looking for and build something they don't have a category for? She didn't know exactly what they'd built. She knew the shape of it from what Parvez had told her. Not a weapon. Not a counter-force in any conventional sense. Something that operated in the space between what the compact's assessment framework was designed to see and what actually existed. Something that worked specifically because the compact's greatest strength, 600 years of successful pattern recognition, had become, without anyone in the compact realizing it, their most precise and navigable limitation. She thought about the Cape Town paper, Veluun sensory biology. The way the olfactory cognitive map worked, comprehensive within its parameters, incapable of generating data outside them. He had mapped everything he knew to look for. He had no map for what he didn't know to look for. The crisis, when it came, was not loud. She'd expected loudness. Some part of her had spent 6 weeks braced for a moment that would feel like a confrontation, raised voices, emergency alerts, the drama that history usually attached to its turning points. What happened instead was quiet enough that she almost missed it. On day 69, the second Veluun ship in orbit began transmitting on a frequency it had not used before. The transmission was not addressed to the Council. It was addressed, through standard Alliance relay infrastructure, to the nearest compact facility 14 light-years away. She intercepted it, or rather, the relay system she was operating intercepted it, in a way that was either an oversight or deliberate, and she had learned these past weeks that there were no oversights anymore. The transmission was in Veluun administrative cipher, and she couldn't read it directly. But she could read the metadata. Specifically, she could read the priority classification, which was a 6-character code she'd never seen before, and which, when she ran it against the Veluun bureaucratic classification tables she'd accessed in the research archives 2 weeks ago, resolved to a category that stopped her breathing for a moment. The category was Assessment Revision, Major Divergence Detected. She sat very still. Then she sent a relay to Dr. Osai. 20 minutes later, Dr. Osai appeared in the relay room and read the metadata and said nothing for a long time. Mara said, "They found something." Dr. Osai said, "Yes," Mara said. "Do we know what?" Dr. Osai said. We know what they were supposed to find on day 72. We don't know if this is that or something earlier. Mara felt the familiar sensation of the past 2 months, the floor of her understanding dropping slightly, revealing more floor beneath. She said, "There was something we wanted them to find on day 72. Dr. Osa looked at her with the expression of a person who has been managing information carefully and is deciding how much further to extend that management. Then she said, "The map he built is accurate. Everything he confirmed is where he thinks it is. Everything he mapped as our resistance capability is real." Mara waited. Dr. Osa said, "It's also everything we were willing to give up." She understood then, not all of it, she would never understand all of it, that wasn't the kind of story it was, but enough. The shape of it, the long logic of it, every system Irath Vel had mapped, every arsenal, every orbital array, every piece of persistent harm infrastructure cataloged in the demand and confirmed in the verification session. It was real. It was present. It was exactly where he thought it was. It was also exactly what they'd decided, months before he arrived, they could afford to hand over. Not because it didn't matter. Because they'd built something that mattered more, in the gap between what a 600-year institution knew to look for and what human beings, humans who had spent their entire, recorded history building things in exactly this kind of gap, under exactly this kind of pressure, with exactly this kind of accumulated knowledge about how power works when it's trying to look inevitable, had built instead. She thought about the 31 civilizations. The Jeth Aram, quiet and present and not speaking in their own voice. She thought about what the compact had offered them and what they'd accepted and whether the mathematics of it, one species against an interstellar institution, had simply been true for them in a way it wasn't quite true for humanity. Not because humanity was stronger, because humanity had done this to itself, version after version, for thousands of years. Had been the empire and the colony, the institution and the dissident, the overwhelming force and the thing that survived underneath it. Had built in that long, ugly school, a kind of knowledge that had no single name and no clean expression, but lived in the way human negotiators asked questions they already knew the answer to. And in the way human engineers built pressure anomalies into filtration systems, and in the way a communications relay operator noticed a blank white square where a priority code should have been and kept noticing things quietly for 69 days until the shape of it resolved. Irath Vel requested an emergency session with the council on day 71. Mara wasn't in the room. She was in sublevel 9, which was where Dr. Os had asked her to be without explanation that morning. She sat next to the pressure regulator, the anomaly that had never been fixed, and listened to the building around her and thought about the fact that she still didn't know precisely what was running through these systems. Parvez hadn't fully told her. Dr. Os hadn't told her. Whatever it was, it existed in a space the compact didn't have language for, which meant it existed in a space their assessment framework couldn't flag, which meant it had been there, running quietly for months, while Irath Vel mapped everything else. She thought, he's going to ask them to explain it. And they're going to explain it, because they've had 71 days to decide exactly how much of the explanation to give, and in what order, and what to let him infer versus what to state. And every part of that conversation was prepared by people who have spent their entire careers studying how to provide true information in a sequence that communicates something other than its full shape. She thought, he's going to leave that meeting knowing more and understanding less. She thought about his sensory fan. Sweeping a room, finding trace compounds, believing it was reading the room, not reading the people. The emergency session lasted 4 hours. The transmission to the compact facility 14 light-years away went out immediately afterward, and this one she could partially read, because it used a lower-tier cipher and her access to the Veluun communication tables had expanded in the past 2 weeks in ways she'd stopped questioning. The transmission said, in the formal administrative language of a 600-year institution, assessment of subject civilization requires full revision. Resistance topology model incomplete. Nature of incompleteness, unknown. Recommend suspension of implementation timeline pending comprehensive re-evaluation. She read it 3 times. Nature of incompleteness, unknown. Not. Nature of incompleteness is X and we need to address X not. We've discovered Y and here is our revised approach. Unknown. A category the Compact's assessment framework had never needed to contain because 31 times 31 civilizations, the map had been sufficient. The map had always covered it. There had never been something outside the map. She sat in sublevel 9 next to the unfixed pressure anomaly and thought about what it cost the Compact institutionally to transmit the word unknown. She thought about the Jeth Aram. She thought, they didn't have an immune response. They hadn't seen the shape before. The math was simply true for them, she thought. For us the math looked true too, from the outside. That was necessary, that was part of it. She thought about what it had taken. Not the engineering, not the infrastructure. The human part of it. 2 months of 70 people in a room performing with complete precision the exact texture of a civilization conceding. Performing it for a sensory system that could chemically read atmospheric composition and structural confidence. Performing it well enough that the map said, harmonization ready. Performing it while knowing, while living with the knowledge, that if it failed, if Irath Vel's map picked up a single inconsistency, the Compact would not extend the timeline. The Compact would not renegotiate. The Compact had a 600-year record and 31 precedents and the institutional certainty of something that had never failed. She thought, what does it cost a person to do that? To perform surrender completely for 69 days for a being who is chemically reading your fear. She thought about Dr. Osai's voice on the audio feed, asking careful questions, never breaking. She thought about what that required. She thought about what humans had always required of people who understood that the only way through was through, and who did it anyway at cost over time without the certainty of outcome. She thought, this is the thing we've never been able to explain to anyone who hasn't lived it, that we can lose and keep going, that we can perform our own defeat and still know we haven't lost, that the part of us that persists isn't the part that wins, it's the part that continues. The Compact withdrew Irath Vel's delegation on day 83. Not formally, not with a declared suspension of the harmonization process. They simply announced, through the standard alliance channels, that the assessment timeline was being extended for supplementary evaluation, and that the diplomatic mission would temporarily relocate to an orbital position while the evaluation was conducted. The Council responded with a diplomatic note expressing continued commitment to constructive engagement. Mara was not in the complex when the delegation departed. She had been reassigned again, this time to a facility she would not name in any document, in a location she would not specify, doing work she understood only partially and didn't need to understand fully, because her part of it was the part she'd always been doing, noticing things, routing them, making sure the right information reached the right people through the right architecture. She heard later that Irath Vel, as he departed the complex for the final time, paused in the main corridor. The security officers who were present, different ones than the first day, reported that he stood for several seconds without moving. His sensory fan extended fully. He swept the entire entrance hall. Whatever he found, whatever atmospheric trace, whatever compound signature, whatever the chemical residue of months of human activity resolved to in the language of Veluun sensory cognition, he did not share with his delegation. He transmitted nothing in the 23 minutes between that moment and departure. The record showed only a pause in the corridor and then movement toward the exit. One of the security officers, in a debrief she would read 3 weeks later, described his expression during those 23 seconds. The officer, who had served in 3 diplomatic postings and had a vocabulary for alien effect that most humans didn't, said it wasn't fear exactly. It wasn't anger. It was something that, in her interpretation, mapped closest to the expression of someone who has just realized that the landscape they've been navigating isn't the landscape they thought, and that the difference isn't local, that it extends in every direction. She described it as the look of someone who is no longer certain where the map ends. The Compact did not resume the harmonization process. They did not formally abandon it either. It existed, in Alliance records as a suspended procedure, a case file with an open status and no scheduled resolution date. The bureaucratic language of incompletion. 32 was not added to the Compact's record of successful harmonizations, nor was anything else. The Alliance sent 3 separate inquiry delegations over the following year. Mara processed communications for one of them and recognized, in the questions they asked, the shape of an institution trying to understand what had happened without being willing to say it didn't understand. The inquiries were framed as process reviews, as quality assurance exercises, as standard follow-up to an extended assessment timeline. None of them received an answer that fully resolved the case. She thought about Irath Vel's map. She thought about 31 civilizations and the clean institutional confidence of a process that had worked 31 times, and how the 32nd time it had encountered something it didn't have a category for, and what that did to a 600-year model of how civilizations work. She thought about the Jeth Aram, still quiet, still present in records, still not speaking in their own voice. She thought, we didn't win, not in any sense they'd recognize as winning. We just remained something they couldn't finish mapping. She was in Arkhangelsk for work 3 years later when she walked past the facility she'd once seen noted in a movement log, the one in a region that had nothing of strategic interest. It looked like nothing, deliberately like nothing. The kind of deliberately unremarkable architecture that you only notice if you've learned in the past 3 years what deliberately unremarkable architecture is for. She didn't go in. She didn't know if she'd be cleared. She kept walking. She thought about what Parvez had said. Don't look for the others. She'd looked for one. She'd found enough. She'd understood over the years since that what she'd found had been part of what she was supposed to find, that the subseries files had been accessible because a system that runs entirely invisible has no external confirmation that it's working, and that some amount of careful, internal, monitored discovery was itself part of the architecture. A way of checking whether the invisible things remained invisible to the right eyes. She understood now, a test. Had always been a kind of test. Not a test she'd passed or failed, but a test that had run and collected information and fed back into a system too distributed and patient and carefully human to have a single name. She walked past the building. The Arkhangelsk sky was low and gray and cold in the specific way she'd come to associate with things being real rather than represented. A kind of sky that didn't care about your model of it. She thought about Irath Vel in the corridor. His sensory fan extended. 23 seconds of reading the air. She thought. He was trying to find out if we were afraid. She thought. He was reading the air in a building full of people who had spent 2 months learning in front of him how to let their fear be real and present and completely visible, while everything built underneath it remained somewhere his map had no coordinates for. She thought that's the thing. The fear was real, is real, has always been real. We were afraid the whole time. We're afraid now. And we built it all anyway inside the fear because that's the only place we've ever built anything that lasted. The Compact had been looking for a species that wasn't afraid. A resistance topology built on certainty and strength and the clean, mappable architecture of confidence. That was what 31 harmonizations had taught them to look for. They'd found a species that was afraid, obviously, measurably, chemically readable in the atmospheric trace compounds of every room they'd occupied, and had done it all anyway. There was no entry in their assessment framework for that. There was no category in 600 years of institutional knowledge for a civilization that is frightened, visibly, completely, without concealment and continues. That performs its own defeat with genuine fear behind it. That builds in the space between terror and persistence, not despite the terror but sort of alongside it with it through it, because that is the only space humans have ever truly known how to work in. Irath Vel had swept the room and found fear. He'd updated his map. He hadn't understood that the map was what they'd given him to find. The fear was real. The rest was also real. And the galaxy, slowly, was beginning to understand that it had never encountered a species for which both of those things could be true simultaneously. A species that was afraid all the way down and could not be stopped by that, because stopping was a response to fear that somewhere in some deep structural layer of human experience had never fully taken hold. Not the strongest species, not the most advanced, not the chosen or the destined or the ones with the better weapons. Just the ones who were still here, still building, still afraid, still going. The Compact's case file remained open. The Jeth Aram remained quiet. The pressure anomaly on sublevel 9 was never fixed. And somewhere in the gap between what an assessor's map could hold and what human beings actually were, something continued to run, patient, distributed, built from the residue of every time humanity had been on this side of an impossible situation, and had found not strength, not certainty, not the absence of fear, but the particular and terrible and wholly human capacity to continue anyway, long past the point where any rational civilization, any civilization that had learned to associate survival with wisdom, would have looked at the mathematics and stopped. The galaxy had 31 examples of how that story ended. It did not yet have a category for a civilization that already knew all 31 from the inside and had decided that the mathematics could wait,